We hear in the news all the time that there's a great shortage of workers in our country. There are not enough workers to fulfill the jobs that need to be done. And that's becoming an increasing problem. If there's not enough workers, then we have trouble on all fronts. Well, we have a situation here in the local congregation at College View wherein there are some jobs that need to be filled, and we're looking for the right workers to fill those jobs. And of course, the jobs that we're talking about pertain to the office of deacon. We introduced this subject 2 weeks ago, and I intended to continue last week and this week discussing the subject of deacons with the view toward appointing some men to serve as deacons in the local congregation here. Of course, I was out last week, and so in order to sort of move this thing forward, I'm going to try to, as quickly as I can, combine the topics that I intended to teach last week and this week. So hopefully it won't go too long. I intend not to, but I'm going to try to combine two lessons so that we can sort of get all this information in our minds together as we move toward this process of appointing some men to serve as deacons. We thank you for being here tonight. We appreciate your attendance very much and your interest and diligence that brings you back on Sunday night. That's very encouraging. You're an encouragement to all the rest of us. Thanks for being here tonight. Thanks to any and all who are visiting with us too, by the way. Let's talk about deacons. Let's talk about their work and then talk about their qualifications. So let's start out first of all talking about the work that deacons are to do. The word deacon literally comes from a word that means servant. Now, it's not the word doulos, which is a slave or a bondservant. This is somebody who is owned by someone else and is sort of in enforced labor. That's not this word. That is a word that could be translated servant as well. But it's more like, we would think more along the lines of someone who is a slave. The word for deacon is from this Greek word, diakonos, and it is actually a transliterated word. You can almost see deacon in that word. Sort of like baptism comes from the Greek word baptizo. Well, the word for deacon comes from this Greek word diakonos, and it has an important, unique meaning. Thayer says it refers to one who executes the commands of another, especially those of a master, a servant, attendant, or minister. And so I think this is particularly interesting, one who executes the commands of another. In other words, someone under authority who does and completes assignments given to them. Vine says that it primarily denotes a servant, whether as doing servile work or as an attendant rendering free service without particular reference to its character. And so the idea of a deacon, from the very meaning of the word, is that this is a job of one who is working, one who is providing service. And for that reason, and we'll be stressing in our lesson tonight, if a man cannot work, then he should not take on this role of deacon. You know, there might be a number of reasons why a person couldn't do the work. Maybe certain family considerations and obligations limit him. He just doesn't have the time or ability to serve because he has so many other rightfully pressing obligations. Maybe if a man is honest, maybe his secular job is so demanding upon him that he cannot adequately serve in a special capacity in the local church. And so understanding that this word for deacon literally means one who serves and works, if a man cannot or will not work, then he should not assume the role of a deacon. We'll be stressing that a little bit more. Someone might object and say, well, you're saying that deacons are servants, but I thought all Christians were supposed to be servants. And that, of course, is exactly true. In John chapter 12, verse 26, if any man serve me, let him follow me, and where I am, there shall also my servant be. Notice, servant. If any man serve me, him will my Father honor. This is talking about us all, right? This is not talking about a special office. This is not speaking about a few specific individuals. All Christians are to be servants. In fact, Jesus said in Matthew chapter 23, verse 11, he that is greatest among you shall be your servant. And so it is definitely true that all Christians are servants, but there is a special office and work for deacons as is described in the Scripture. There's a special office of deacons in the church. In Philippians chapter 1, verse 1, Paul and Timotheus, the servants of Jesus Christ, to all the saints in Christ Jesus which are at Philippi, with the bishops and deacons. So it talks about all the saints, but then it specifically identifies the bishops or elders and the deacons. And so clearly there was a distinction there. They were among all the saints, but they were particularly identified there as the deacons of the church. In the text that Damon read for us earlier, we're going to be paying a lot of attention to these several verses in our study tonight. In 1 Timothy chapter 3, beginning verse 8, we have this listing of the necessary qualifications, and we'll look at those here momentarily. But I want you to notice that it mentions the office of a deacon. Let these be first proved, let them then use the office of deacon. And again, down here, for they that have used the office of a deacon well, purchase to themselves a good degree, and so forth. And so, again, we are describing those who would take on an assigned role in the local church, and that they would provide a work of service in the local congregation. So that being the case then, we would ask the question, what is their special work? And I think that's an important question to ask. You know, if you go for a job interview, there's a job and you go to interview for it, one of the things you want to know is what would be required of me on this job? The one interviewing you has certain questions to ask, but you want to ask, what is this job? For instance, if this job is to sit in an office at a desk and do office work, that'd be one thing. But if it's to clean the dirty toilets in the shop, that's a different question altogether. I don't know, what kind of work am I expected to do here? And I think that's a fair question when we talk about that deacons are to perform a role of service, working in the local congregation. What is their special work? Well, it might be helpful to point out the things that it is not. For instance, their special work is not to do the work of the elders. And we're not going to take time to read and study this text thoroughly because we did this in our previous lesson in Acts chapter 6 when we were talking about those men who were appointed to serve in the church at Jerusalem. They're not called deacons, and we understand that, but the role that they were assigned there seems very parallel to what we identify as the work of deacons in the New Testament church. But I want to remind you that the reason why these men were appointed is because the apostles said that it is not reason that we should leave the Word of God and serve tables. The apostles, who were at that time the leaders of the church there in Jerusalem, understood that there was a work that needed to be done, but it didn't make sense for them to leave the work they were doing to do this other work that needed to be done, and so these men were appointed. And so, again, elders are not apostles, and the men chosen here in Acts chapter 6 are not called deacons per se, but I believe there is a parallel relationship there. Elders have particular roles. They have their duties to perform as the overseers of the local congregation. That's their role. There's other work that needs to be done, and if others can provide that work, it leaves the elders open to accomplish their work, and so that's sort of what we see here. The work of deacons is not the work of elders, but I want to suggest to you that the work of deacons is not to do the work of other members either. You know, it is not the case that we might appoint some men here coming up, appoint some men to do some special work in the local congregation. Oh, well, the rest of us can just sit back and not have to do anything now. We'll just leave it up to the deacons to do it all. That is absolutely not true. And I want to draw your attention back to that text that we already looked at in John 12:26. If any man serve me. In other words, all of us are expected to serve. And although some men may be appointed to a special work of service in the office of deacon, that does not mean the rest of us just now sit back and do nothing. We've got to keep working. We all work. We all are servants. And so, again, we cannot maybe be totally specific. The role, the work, and the specific assignments that deacons will perform may vary from time to time and from place to place. But in the general sense, we would say their work is not the work of elders, and it's not the work of everybody else either. They have unique, special assigned duties. Now, I just want to briefly talk about the appointing of deacons, because that's mostly what we talked about in our initial lesson here. And so we won't go into this too deeply. But we do have some guidance in Acts chapter 6 about how this should be done. Again, we're not going to take time to dissect that passage again, but I want to refer it to your memory. Acts chapter 6 sort of sets a pattern for choosing men to serve in the local congregation. We even reference this passage in regards to the appointment of elders. Certainly it applies to the appointment of deacons, I think. And so I just want to remind you, we're not going to take time to study that text again for sake of time, but remember, we have some divine guidance on the appointing of these men. Someone might say, well, why don't we just name some men and then we'll just let them sort of grow into the job. Well, actually, that's not a biblical approach. I want to reference you to 1 Timothy 3 again. And we're going to be looking a lot at 1 Timothy 3. But in verse 8 begins the qualifications of deacons. And it says, likewise must deacons be grave, not double-tongued, so on it goes. We'll look at that in a minute. Let these also first be proved, and then let them use the office of deacon, being found blameless. And so the idea, well, we'll just name some guys, whoever, and we'll sort of let them grow into the job. That's not the way it's done. The ones who would be appointed to special duties as deacons have already necessarily proved themselves to be the kind of individuals who would be capable of doing the work and who would be faithful to do the work. Let these also first be proved. So, again, the point is, there's some qualifications to be met, and we'll talk about them in a minute. How many should be appointed? That's a fair question. We tried to deal with that in our initial lesson. And I remind you again of Acts chapter 6, although we're not studying this text again tonight. I wanted you to remember that the apostles led the congregation in choosing 7 men. And we talked about this, if you recall, 2 weeks ago. The church in Jerusalem numbered in the thousands at this point. The very first day the Jerusalem church began, there were 3,000. Shortly thereafter, it mentions 5,000 men. And if that is in fact just a number of the men, there may have been an equivalent or greater number of women. Certainly, without doubt, the church at Jerusalem numbered in the thousands. Yet the apostles said, we want you to seek out 7 men of honest report and so forth. Clearly, it was that this was the number needed to do the work that was wanting. These widows in the church at Jerusalem needed to be served. They saw that 7 men would be a proper number to address the job that needs to be done. And I really want to stress that to us in that, you know, there are, I think, a number of men in the College View congregation that are qualified to serve as deacons. And I can just give you a heads up now, not everybody that's qualified will be named. We're going to be looking for men to do specific jobs that we feel need to be accomplished. There may be other jobs that come along in the future and more men can be added. But in regards to deacons, you name the number of men you need to do the job that needs to get done. I think this is different than elders, and we mentioned this a couple weeks ago. In regards to elders, I believe you appoint all the men who are qualified. But in regards to deacons, you name the number of men that are needed to do the job that needs to get done. I think there is a difference there. I want to suggest to you 2 rules that need to be followed in this appointment process. The first rule is it would be wrong to appoint a man who is not willing or able to do the work of service that the office requires. And we talked about that already. This is not an honorary position. This is not something that some guy can sit back and say, boy, look at me, man. I was named a deacon in the church. I'm pretty special. I got a special badge. You know, I'm a deacon. This is not a position, an honorary position. It's not a designation that makes someone better than the next. This is an office of work and service. And if a man doesn't understand that and is not willing or able, there may be sometimes that you wouldn't be able to, as we mentioned. Maybe family obligations, work requirements, or whatever may not leave you enough time to be able to do the work. Okay, we understand that. That's not necessarily a bad thing. That might change in the future, but right now that's the reality of your life. Okay, that's fine. You're not able to do the work, therefore you shouldn't take the job. On the other hand, if a fellow is just not even willing to work, he shouldn't take the job. So that's an important first rule. And then the second rule, which will lead us to the second part of our study, is that it would be wrong to appoint a man who is not qualified. You know, this is not a popularity contest. You know, I like old brother. So he's just such a fun guy to be around. He's always joking and cutting up. He's always in a happy mood. And I just really love to. I just love to spend time with old brother so and so. He's just a lot of fun. This is not a popularity contest. There are certain necessary qualifications that have to be met, and we want to look at those now. So we looked at the work. Let me back up just a minute. We looked at the work. Now let's talk about qualifications. And if we're going to talk about qualifications, there's just one text to approach, and that's the one that Damon read for us earlier from 1 Timothy 3, beginning verse 8. Now, let's just walk down through this text and pick out the qualifications that are named. Likewise must the deacons be grave. The word grave there is a synonym of the words dignified, serious, and solemn. This describes someone, it doesn't describe someone who has a perpetual frown on their face. Here's a guy who's never happy. He never smiles. He never tells a joke. He never cuts up. No, that's not equivalent here. But this is descriptive of someone who's capable of being serious in situations which demand a serious approach. And so grave would suggest the idea of a person who understands serious matters, who respects, in particular would respect the gravity of the work of the office of elder. This is a fellow who can be serious about important business. He must be grave. He must not be double-tongued. This is from a Greek word that you can almost see it. The Greek word here is dilogos. 2 words. This is a guy who says 2 words. He says one thing, but maybe means another. Or he says one thing to one party and something different to another party on the same subject. This really goes to the question of basic trustworthiness and honesty. And so he's not double-tongued. When he says something, you can believe it. When he says something, you can count on it. He'll tell you the truth, and he'll consistently say those things that are right. He is a man not given to much wine. Other versions, I think, for instance, the New American Standard Version says not addicted to much wine. This is an unfortunate thing right here. This expression, unfortunately, has been used by some of our own brethren to justify social drinking. And they say, well, look here's deacons. These are worthy men in a local church. And it doesn't say don't drink at all. It says not given to much wine. They shouldn't drink a lot of wine, but that leaves open the possibility that they can drink some wine. That's the argument that is usually given. Now, our purpose tonight is not to dive into the subject of social drinking. We've done that before, and we will do it again. The New Testament plainly condemns social drinking throughout. And I'm not even going to take time to remind you of the arguments that we make about that. But this expression, not given to much wine, to use it to suggest that you could drink some just as long as you don't drink too much is really a crazy, faulty argument. The old illustration that you've probably heard me use before, when our kids were little, like on Wednesday night, Cindy and I would get them cleaned up and dressed for church before we then got cleaned up and dressed for church. And the kids would invariably say, "Can we go out and play until it's time to go?" And our response to that would be, "Yes, but don't get all dirty." Don't get all dirty. Now you can get dirty up to your knees. You can wade in the mud up to your knees just so long as you're not all dirty. That's not what we meant, right? That was not a license to get somewhat dirty. That expression doesn't mean that, right? And that's the same expression. You're not giving him much wine. This guy's not, and other versions say not addicted to wine. But that statement does not justify drinking in lesser amounts. It's just not in that. The New Testament condemns social drinking throughout. Thankfully, this is not a problem at College View. But I'm going to say, sadly, among some of our brethren, it's an increasing problem as some try to justify social drinking. We're looking for men not given too much wine. Not greedy of filthy lucre. The New American Standard version there says, not fond of sordid gain, not desiring disgraceful gain. You know, that's an interesting thought. And the question might be, why would that be listed here? Well, you can imagine. For instance, it might be so that deacons are in a situation where they have access to and use of collective funds of the local congregation. You can imagine, for instance, those 7 men in Acts chapter 6. Wouldn't it have been very possible that they might have been given some money to buy the food that the widows needed? And in the process of handling that money, they could have slipped some into their own pockets. Sordid gain. Deacons today might be in that same kind of situation. And we want a man who obviously would not be tempted in that fashion, not greedy of filthy lucre. Holding the mystery of the faith in a pure conscience. This expression clearly means that they must be knowledgeable. The mystery of the faith has been revealed. It's not a mystery anymore. And so they need to know the truth. They need to know the mystery of the faith. That clearly would indicate that they need to be knowledgeable individuals. They know their Bibles. Consider for a minute, go back to Acts 6 again. Those 7 men in Acts 6, you know who 2 of them were, right? Stephen and Philip. And what did Stephen and Philip do subsequent to that? Well, I'm sure they filled that role that they were assigned to do. But they also immediately began preaching the gospel. They were chosen as special servants in the church at Jerusalem, but they went on in preaching the gospel. And I think are probably even better known for that than for that work of service they were appointed to do. Notice that you hold the mystery of the faith in a pure conscience. And the pure conscience means they're obviously that not only do they know the truth, but they practice the truth. They put it into practice in their daily lives. All right, now skip ahead a little bit down here to about verse 12. I don't have the verse numbers here. I think this is about verse 12. Let the deacons be the husband of one wife. That's a very straightforward statement, right? And so a deacon has to be a married man, has to be a husband of one wife. I think it goes without saying that this would preclude someone who was a polygamist from being a deacon. Of course, if he's a polygamist, we got other problems too. We're going to have to address that because that's condemned in the New Testament. Polygamy is condemned in the New Testament. But the husband of one wife would suggest that here's a man who is scripturally married. This would in a more practical way preclude someone who is unscripturally divorced and married to another woman. He must be the rightful husband of one wife. He's ruling their children and their own houses well. And so he has to have children. Of course, this goes back to the old question that we have studied before. We think that a man who has one child qualifies as having children. We don't have to make that argument again. But it is clear that the deacon has to be a married man with children. There's an interesting difference here between deacons and elders. Titus 1 verse 6 says about elders that they must have faithful children. Do you notice that that's not here in this statement? They have to rule their children in their own house as well, but it doesn't say that their children have to be believers. We think in the case of elders that they must have faithful children, Christians, children who are Christians. But in regards to deacons, not necessarily so. It might be the case, but it doesn't necessarily have to be the case. They have to have children, but they don't necessarily have to be believing children. They might, and very often we think, and you probably have recollections of men who were deacons, and maybe their children were still quite young and not yet of age to obey the gospel, but they'd still be qualified if that's the case. Notice that they have established a track record. They are ruling their own children and their own houses well. Here's a guy, he's married, he's got children, but his household situation is an absolute train wreck. I mean, he doesn't have a good relationship with his wife, and his children are wild and disobedient. He's not ruling his own house well. He's not the right guy for the job, right? How can he serve adequately in the Lord's church, in the Lord's household, if he can't manage his own household well? The text says, now backing up again, let these first be proved. Now we already talked about that. In other words, we're not going to appoint them and let them grow to meet these qualifications. They must already be proved. They must have already established these things as being so. And so in regards to deacons, we're looking for men who have proved themselves to be faithful and diligent. Let them first be proved, then let them use the office of deacon, being found blameless. And I think the blamelessness contextually here would be blameless in regards to fulfilling the qualifications that this text sets forth. And so let them first be proved, then let them use the office of deacon, being found blameless. All right. Now, there's one other thing that's in this text that's included in these qualifications, and it has to do with the wives of these men. Even so must their wives be. By the way, I just make a side note here. Some people have tried, some liberal folks have tried to suggest that this is actually describing not necessarily the wives of the deacons, but the women who might be appointed as deacons. And lots of denominational groups appoint women deacons. I'm sad to say some of our very liberal brethren have also done that, appoint women as deacons. It's not talking about, I think it's correctly translated. This is the King James Version, but other reliable translations do not suggest it's talking about women generally. It's talking about the women of these men. The women of these men who would be appointed deacons, the wives of these deacons. They must be grave. Again, that's the same word. You know, we talked about that word up here. The men were to be grave. The women are to be grave. That is dignified, serious, solemn, capable of being serious about things that demand seriousness. They must be grave. They are not slanderers. Their wives must not be slanderers. The New American Standard Version there uses the expression, not malicious gossips. You ever known a malicious gossip in the church? I'm sad to say I have. My guess is that you have as well. So here's a man, and he's being considered for the office of deacon, but the fact of the matter is that his wife is the worst gossip in the church. Well, she disqualifies him, right? She's not to be a slanderer, not to be a malicious gossip. She is to be a woman who is sober. The word sober here is the word that suggests temperate or self-controlled. So the wife of the deacon must be a woman who is self-controlled and disciplined. You ever heard someone describe that man's wife? I mean, he's a good guy, but his wife is out of control. Well, that would be a disqualifying kind of description, wouldn't it? She's not sober. she is, in a very plain statement, she is to be faithful in all things. Of course, that's the ideal we're all striving for. Men and women alike need to be faithful in all things. But if we have a man whose wife is notably not faithful in all things, it would disqualify him from serving in this capacity. All right, so had to go quickly. I intended to break that up into 2 lessons, but we're going to try to quickly cover it all in one lesson. Deacons, all of us are to be servants, but there is an office of deacon in the church. We know that they are assigned special duties of work, although they may vary from time to time and place to place, but they have special work. In fact, that's the reason why they're assigned. That's the reason why they're appointed, because there are perceived jobs that need to be addressed, and so men are chosen to address those needs, much like the case of the Jerusalem church in Acts chapter 6. So they're appointed to do special work. They must meet the very specific qualifications that are set forth there in 1 Timothy 3, verses 8 through 13. It would be wrong to appoint a man who's not willing or able to do the work, and it would be wrong to appoint a man who is not qualified. All right, that's our thoughts for tonight. We appreciate your good attention to those things and hope it's helpful. And we're going to move forward with this process real soon. But take this all in, assimilate it, think about it, be considering these truths about men who would serve in the office of deacon. Appreciate your good attention. This has not been a lesson teaching or encouraging obedience to the gospel, but we never want to end without providing that opportunity. If you're here, you desire to obey the gospel, or if you're here and need the prayers of the saints, if we can help in any way, let us know while we stand and sing.
He will restore, and your iniquities remember no more. Bring him your every care, if great or small, whatever troubles you, oh, bring it all. Bring it all on faith, the nameless dread. Thy heart he will relieve, and lift up thy head. Blessed Savior of us all, Almighty friend, His presence shall be ours unto the end. Without Him life would be how dark, how drear, but with Him morning break and